bringing AD and AS together now, all we're looking at, we've done all of these in previous presentations, the AD and the AS presentation, just looking at how changes in aggregate demand and aggregate supply affect output, unemployment and inflation. We're specifically looking at how we can represent economic growth, inflation, unemployment and kind of changes in the current account of balance payments. So looking at economic growth, short-run economic growth is the increase in aggregate demand, so that's how we'd represent it on a diagram. And long-run economic growth would be an increase in aggregate supply as well, or long-run aggregate supply. And long-run economic growth is the one that we really like, the sustainable one, because obviously there's a limit to short-run aggregate demand growth that you can have, because this vertical part of aggregate supply represents the maximum productive output of your economy. So looking at inflation, we obviously have two different types of inflation that we look at in the AS course. We have demand pull inflation, which is caused by increases in aggregate demand being larger than the increases in aggregate supply. And we also have cost push inflation caused by rising costs of production or aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply at least, moving inwards. So there we see both price levels increasing, so therefore inflation, but we see two different causes, demand pull and cost push. Unemployment, this is really looking at cyclical unemployment. We have this part is the full employment level, and then the distance between, well, the output gap, the negative output gap, represents the cyclical unemployment. So it's due to a lack of aggregate demand in your economy. And then a current account, so if say we've got an increasing current account deficit, or we're really looking at the trade balance here, because this diagram doesn't take into account net income and net transfers. It's just looking at trading goods and trading services. But if you have an increasing current account deficit or a decreasing surplus, this will cause an inward shift of aggregate demand, and the other way around, if you've got a decreasing deficit or an increasing surplus, should cause an outwards shift of aggregate demand. And this is caused by either X decreasing, so exports decreasing, the value of exports decreasing, or the value of imports increasing, or both occurring at the same time. And a decreasing deficit or an increasing surplus occurs when the value of exports increases, or the value of imports decreases, or both occur at the same time. Okay, so what's really important to know is what are diagrams questions looking for, and so on the diagram they're looking for aggregate demand and aggregate supply correctly labelled. Lots of students get these mixed up and they put demand and supply. It should only, if you're in a macro exam, so national and international economy, it's only one micro diagram that you might want to draw, and that would be exchange rates. But if you're doing aggregate demand and aggregate supply, you should have AD and AS labelled. You should have price level and real GDP, not price and quantity. And they want to see that you can shift the correct curve as well to do your revision. But in the explanation, they'll want to know why that curve has shifted, what's happened to real GDP, what has happened to price level, whether there's been any inflation, deflation, disinflation, and what's happened to unemployment. And they might ask you for some evaluation features. So if it's a comment on question, they might say want some depends upon features such as depends upon the size of the shift, the original position of the economy, and the size of the multiplier if it's a shift in aggregate demand, that is. So let's have a look at a diagram question using aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So we know it's a macro diagram. Analyse the effects of immigration on the economy. So you'd have to set up, let's see if I can do this now. Let's go to presentation mode. Oh, don't think I can do it. Can I do it? No, it's not going to let me draw on this presentation. Right, I'll go back to there. So I imagine we have AD sloping downwards, we have AS sloping upwards. Analyse the effects of immigration on an economy. Well, you have to think, well, what would that affect? Would that affect AD or would it affect aggregate supply? So AD is made up of C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Well, if you have immigration, then you have an increase in your population, and so then we should see an increase in consumer spending. So you might have an increase in aggregate demand. But if you have immigration, you might also have an increase in the quantity of labour in your workforce in your country. So you might have an increase in aggregate supply as well. So let's have a look at the different options. And here we've got a diagram with aggregate supply increasing, and here we have a diagram, or you could have a diagram of just aggregate demand increasing, and here we have a diagram of them both increasing. So 1 mark for, you get a maximum of 5 marks for the diagram, but 1 mark for axes correctly labelled, 1 mark for AD and AS correctly labelled, 1 mark for shift of AS to the right, 1 mark for shift of AD to the right, 1 mark for your original equilibrium and your new equilibrium. That just means doing your dotted lines and your Y and your P on your axes. So what is the explanation as well? So 1 mark for recognising that higher labour force will increase aggregate supply. 2 marks for explaining that higher labour force will increase aggregate supply by raising productive capacity. Oh, you know, that's nice. It's going a bit further than just stating. 1 mark for noting that if extra workers gain employment, AD will increase. Higher population will increase AD. 1 mark for noting it will increase potential economic growth. So potential economic growth is when you have an increase in AS, so it's potential economic. That's a productive capacity. So you know the potential kind of growth that your economy could achieve. 1 mark for noting that it may increase actual economic growth, higher GDP, as long as AD increases. 1 mark for explaining the effect on the price level, you know, so on and on and on. So lots and lots of marks there, and that you've even got a kind of depend upon mark in there as well that you can get, although the question was just to analyse the effects. It didn't necessarily need a comment on. Okay, and this is a nice essay question as well that has been set before. Discuss the extent to which an increase in aggregate demand may affect output, unemployment and inflation. So I would start with definitions of those key terms, and then I'd do a really basic diagram of AD increasing, and I'd say, you know, your typical effect would be real GDP would increase, and I'd explain why, and then unemployment would decrease, and I'd explain why, and inflation, you would have inflation, or inflation would increase, and I'd explain why. And then I'd do your kind of other side and saying, but in certain circumstances you may get an increase in real GDP and no impact on inflation, and I'd explain why. And then you could do another diagram where you're at the vertical, ADs intersecting AS at the vertical part, and you could say, well, you get an increase in the price level, but you get no effect on output or unemployment, and I'd explain why as well. So it was a really nice essay question. It's from quite a while ago, actually. And then this one's more recent. Discuss whether a decrease in aggregate supply is always harmful to national economic performance. So quite similar as well. What's harder about this essay, though, is national economic performance. You've got to make a judgment call about what that actually means. But you'd start off with your normal diagram and saying, well, you know, it would reduce real GDP, and you'd have to look at the kind of distances to look at whether it has, what effect it's had on unemployment. It will definitely have an effect on employment. It should decrease it, and the effect on kind of the price level and whether that's a bad thing or whether it's a good thing. You could explain that, but then you could play around with different diagrams as well, and you could look at a diagram where there's lots of spare capacity and do a kind of decrease in aggregate supply and show the effect. There wouldn't be any effect on those variables, the price level, real GDP and employment. Employment. There might be an effect on unemployment there. And then you could kind of go on from there. So a bit harder essay. Have a look at the mark scheme for that one. It's a really nice essay, a challenging one. What they call a differentiator. It differentiates from the people that, you know, really get the subject and will get the higher grades, and the ones that only maybe have a vague understanding. But you can see there the previous essay question, this one, is pretty much taken directly from the specification. So study your specification, moral of the story.